Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the early modern papacy. Last time we left off with the death of Pope Clement VII on September 25th, 1534. We begin now, they said the recovery of the Church began under the governance of Alessandro Farnese, Farnese, whom the conclave of 1534 elected on October 13th as the 220th Pope. He took the papal name Paul III and ruled for 15 years and 1 month. He was the first Pope of the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation. Is one of these, amusing ironies of history. In every way, Alessandro Farnese appeared to be the wrong man to become Pope in 1534, because he carried within himself and in his personal history and family history virtually every defect of feudalism and the Renaissance. Alessandro was born on the family estate at Canino, south of Viterbo, Italy, on February 20th, 1468, in the palace overlooking the family's private lake, Lake Bolsena. The Farneses were a notorious crime family that made its money as mercenaries, extorting protection money from Italian city-states and traveling merchants. Their money enabled Alessandro to receive what was deemed the finest possible education of the day. In the Renaissance, that meant a humanist education. He studied at Pisa, at Florence, and at Rome. This education left him with refined taste in the arts and a desire to patronize artists. His sister Julia, we have met before. She became one of the mistresses of Pope Alexander VI, a position which she used to get her little brother Alessandro named a cardinal in 1493 at the age of 25. Though he was not even an ordained priest yet, but, that's details. He received the income from the benefices attached to his cardinal's position, none of which he visited or cared for personally. He took a mistress for himself in Rome, and with her had at least 4 illegitimate children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. Then something happened. In the year 1509, Alessandro was named Bishop of Parma by Pope Julius II, for which he had to be ordained a priest and then could be ordained a bishop. It was considered simply another benefice, meaning more revenue, given as a reward for his loyalty to the Pope and his success on several diplomatic missions. The cause of what happened next is not known in detail, because if he kept any personal journals, they have not survived. We can only judge from subsequent events. And from those, we know that in 1509, at the age of 41, Alessandro Farnese underwent a personal conversion. He embraced a life of celibacy as a priest. To do justice to his mistress, he gave her her own sumptuous home and revenue, but he moved out, and he moved into the bishop's residence in Parma. And he arranged it along the lines of a religious community, in as far as that was possible. He and those who were put in his diocesan administration lived in community, they celebrated Mass and the Divine Office together, and it became known as a center for charity. Far less popular among some of the clergy and religious orders were Bishop Farnese's measures to implement the decrees of the Fifth Lateran Council, which we talked about previously, met from 1512 through 1517. Bishop Farnese held diocesan synods for this purpose and followed it with pastoral visitations of every parish and religious house in his jurisdiction. He commanded that priests who were living in concubinage put aside their mistresses, as he had done, and make provision for them and their illegitimate children to live apart, though still provided for. These actions came to the attention of other churchmen, the network, the Catholic underground network, which never completely goes away, who were also working quietly within their scope, attempting to reform the church. Bishop Farnese discovered that there was quite a sizable network of faithful Catholics working to heal the wounds in the church, but they had to operate quietly for fear of attracting the enmity of powerful elements who, out of self-interest, did not want the church reformed. For the next 25 years, Bishop Farnese, Cardinal Bishop Farnese, worked and networked with other reform-minded clerics and steadily maneuvered his way up the curial hierarchy until he became Dean of the College of Cardinals. By the time the conclave of 1434 met, Farnese was respected and admired. He had quietly but effectively reformed his personal life and his diocese. He was 67 years old. He spoke and moved slowly with great deliberation, great consideration. And there were enough men in the conclave who wanted the same for the church that they elected him as Pope 220. He had come very far in his personal and priestly life, but the scars of feudalism and the Renaissance never completely left. One of those scars was the habit of nepotism. In December of 1534, 2 months after his papal election, he named 2 of his grandsons cardinals, even though they were age 14 and 16, respectively. More seriously, his own son and another grandson were open enemies vying for control of the cities of Parma and Piacenza. Pierluigi, his son, was an enemy of Emperor Charles V, and Ottaviano, his grandson, was an ally of Charles V. It will be recalled that a group of German Protestant rulers formed an alliance at Schmalkalden in Hesse-Nassau in 1531. They had, and when Paul was elected, continued, recruiting more rulers of the small German states, who each saw the advantages of Protestant ecclesiology. It was subordinationist, meaning that the church was a department of state. In each case, a new German ruler joining the League was the signal for the suppression of dioceses, monasteries, convents, theft of church property, vandalism of sacred art. No, let's see, I got to talk about something else before I get to the next war. In 1534, 7 men gathered in a Benedictine chapel in Montmartre, which at the time was a suburb north of Paris. Now it's within the city. It's where Sacré-Cœur is, and the giant white church in the north of Paris. It wasn't there at the time. That was built later after the Franco-Prussian War. In 1534, 7 men gathered in a Benedictine chapel in that part of Paris, where they took private vows of chastity, poverty, and a promise to embark on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, if possible, within a year, and if not, then to place themselves at the service of the Holy Father. These were the first Jesuits: Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier, Peter Faber, Alphonse Salmeron, Simon Rodriguez, Nicolas Bobadilla, and Diego Lainez. This action, this private vows, had its origin over a decade earlier, on May 17, 1521, when Inigo Lopez de Loyola the youngest son of a noble Basque family, received a horrible leg wound at the siege of Pamplona. He endured 3 operations stoically, but for over a month was in and out of delirium. He began to improve after June 28th, 1521, and the next day was the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, June 29th, so he attributed his improvement to their intercession. As he was still bedridden, he asked for reading material. Now, his personal interests were history and chivalry, but the place he was staying had only religious material, so out of boredom he just read what was at hand. This introduced him to a book called The Golden Legend, written by a Dominican, Jacques de Vorain. It was a 250-year-old compendium of saints' lives, arranged according to the liturgical calendar. It reflected the piety and worldview of the High Middle Ages. But it was all new to Ignatius, whose training for life had all been military. These noble images of a long-past world filled his daydreams. He noticed that when he reflected on military glory, as he had done all of his life, he became increasingly dry. It left him less and less inspired. But when reflecting on service to God, he experienced joy. This was a key insight in his spiritual development, as he learned in his own life that monitoring feelings and interior dispositions of the heart and mind could provide a window to look deeper into the soul, in a way not otherwise possible. Another pivotal work in Ignatius' spiritual formation was titled Life of Christ, by a Carthusian, Ludolf of Saxony, who for the 14th century. He died in 1377. Like the Golden Legend, the Life of Christ was 2 centuries old by the time Ignatius read it, but it was completely new to him. It was written as a continuous narrative of the life of Christ, from his pre-existence until his ascension and promise to return. The simple, unquestioning faith of the work, as well as its narrative presentation, were formational elements in Ignatius' spiritual imagination, and it provided him with his first exposure to biblical history. At this time, he began keeping a notebook of his reflections, which became the basis of his later spiritual exercises. When he recovered the ability to walk, Ignatius made a pilgrimage to a Benedictine monastery at Montserrat, where he made a 3-day confession. He retook his oaths of knighthood to Christ and to his king after laying his expensive clothes and sword on an altar of Mary. He departed for Barcelona, but stopped on the way at Manresa, where he spent 11 months, from February of 1522 to March of 1523. There, in a cave near the Cordonier River, he immersed himself in personal reflection, prayer, and spiritual writing. There, at Manresa, Ignatius' spiritual journey went to a deeper level. As he grappled with the vicious alternation of scrupulosity at one extreme versus the overwhelming temptation to return to worldly pleasures at the other extreme. In waging this inner war, he developed a spiritual shorthand, which became his rules for discernment of spirits, meaning for determining which inclinations were from God and which were from Satan. The culmination of this extended retreat took place between August 1522 and February 1523, during which he had the most profound experience of his life, religious experience of his life. He was given the grace of infused contemplation. It did not consist of locutions or visions, but instead was an elevation of his understanding into the workings of the human soul and into the divine plan. This experience shaped the remainder of his life. He felt that he had been remade and devoted the rest of his days to the church. In 1523, he went to the Holy Land, but the Franciscans there paid for his passage to go back home because they were afraid that his efforts at proselytizing would bring down on them the wrath of the Turkish Muslims, who, controlled the Holy Land at that point. After his return to Europe, Ignatius felt that it was time to correct the embarrassing limitations of his education. I mean, he had basic literacy. I mean, he could read and write, but that not much else because he, was going to be a soldier. So, at the age of 33, he went back to school to learn Latin, the international language of education. For the next 11 years, 1524 to 1535, he trained his mind in theology and scripture as he had already trained his spirit. He also began sharing his spiritual methods with others, which resulted in his being summoned before the Inquisition at Alcalá in 1526 and again at Salamanca in 1527, because some, were heard he was doing something. They thought that he was imitating confession, that he was, even though he wasn't a priest yet, but it seemed like that people were going to him in a sense for confession. But he was cleared by the Inquisition in both cases, because they just, called people in. Well, did he give you absolution? Well, no, he didn't. Okay, so, but he decided to relocate to the University of Paris because he felt that his ignorance of French would keep ordinary people from seeking him out. Yet his knowledge of Latin meant that fellow students could and did seek him out. In 1534, Ignatius and 6 companions gathered in another Benedictine chapel in Montmartre, and so this catches us up with the intro. There they took vows of chastity, poverty, and a promise to embark on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land within a year, or if that didn't work out, to place themselves at the service of the Holy Father. They gathered in Venice in 1537, but were unable to gain passage to the Holy Land because of another in a series of cyclical wars between Venice and the Ottoman Turks. So they went to Rome, where they came into the presence of Pope Paul III. There was no way he was going to let these guys go to the east because he had other work for them. So on September 27th, 1540, he issued a decree, Remini Militantis Ecclesiae, establishing the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. And they became an instrument of papal reform during and after the Council of Trent. On November 25th, 1535, 28 women, this time, females, took private vows of consecration before God in Brescia, Italy, Brescia. They were led by St. Angela Merici, Merici. Born in 1474, Italian, she was orphaned at an early age. She received her first infused grace in the form of a vision of assurance that her older sister, who had died suddenly, that her older sister was in heaven, even though she died without having received last rites or confession. In gratitude, Angela devoted herself to good works, becoming a Franciscan tertiary, a third order Franciscan, working with poor women in Brescia, Italy. In 1524, she took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which changed her life. On the island of Crete, she was stricken with blindness. Her companions were going to turn back, but she wouldn't let them. She went with them, and holding their hands. She visited all the holy places, even though she couldn't see. But there, she was given inner consolations, which she believed were deeper than if she had been distracted with her sight. Her sight returned on the return trip back on the island of Crete, So when she made it back to Italy, she gathered a group of faithful women around her. Now, they were not in habit or in vows, but they did their best to live good lives of service, particularly educating poor girls in the faith and correct living. They met regularly for classes and prayers. On November 25th, 1535, 28 of them took vows of consecration before God, at this point still private vows. In 1544, 4 years after Angela's death, Pope Paul III approved the Company of St. Ursula as a religious congregation for the first religious community of women devoted exclusively to education. They placed themselves under the patronage of St. Ursula, as she was a 4th century martyr in Cologne who was revered in the medieval period as a patroness of education. So, Angela, she would never have called it after herself, that's why it's the Ursulines. And the Ursulines became the first female congregation, religious congregation in North America. First at Quebec in 1634, and then right here in New Orleans in 1727. In June of 1536, Michelangelo Buonarroti re-enters our story. He returned in June of 1536 to the Sistine Chapel, a quarter century after completing the ceiling. The late Pope, the one we talked about previously, Clement VII, had commissioned him to paint a fresco rendering of the resurrection on the wall above the altar, or behind the altar, So Clement died before he could finish. So the new Pope, Paul III, changed the commission to be a fresco rendering the second coming of Christ and the last judgment, based on Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. The wall in question had 2 windows, which Michelangelo bricked over to give him, a uniform surface. But to make it, he had to brick over the whole wall, to cover those windows. And while he was at it, he sloped it inward from the top. So like if you imagine, so if you're looking at the wall, but then if you walk along the side and look at it from this, then it would be sloped. It would be sloped this way. So, from the top down, and then here was the altar. He did that. He hoped that the downward slope would shed the dust. No. I mean, it's not. The slope isn't this steep, of course, but it's. He was 61 years old when he began. It was completed and unveiled on the Eve of All Saints, October 31st, 1541. In the course of it, he once fell off the scaffolding while he was alone. He crawled home. He was out of commission for weeks. Yet in time, he covered a surface 48 feet tall, 44 feet wide, with nearly 400 figures, using the high-pressure fresco style. At the top center is Christ, returned in glory, as judge of the living and the dead. The Blessed Mother is at his right hand, but from the viewer, if you're standing on the floor looking, it's on the left, and that's in her role as intercessor. On both sides, but slightly below his level, are those to be judged. They're standing on clouds. In the lower third of his right, the viewer's left, the dead are rising for judgment. In the same level on his left, the viewer's right, those judged to be damned are being pulled down into hell. On the lower left of Jesus, the viewer's right, St. Bartholomew stands on a cloud holding his flayed skin. That's how Bartholomew was martyred. On the skin, Michelangelo painted a tortured rendering of his own face. Now, many interpretations have been made of this. Bartholomew, at the time, well, it still is, the patron saint of plasterers, which is appropriate for a fresco, which was painted into wet plaster. As for his self-portrait on the skin, possibly his driven work habits left him feeling that he had sacrificed some of his life energy with each work, and he was no longer young. At the lowest level, he used pagan images to depict hell. Charon, the ferryman, Minos, the king of Crete, as judge of the underworld. And Minos still has his donkey ears, which were given as punishment for his stupidity in asking that everything he touched turn to gold, which was exciting until he tried to eat. He forfeited the power when he turned his own daughter into gold, accidentally. But he was given the donkey ears as punishment for that. Now, the issue of nudity in the art arose once more. We've seen this periodically, and because of the Renaissance. Now, particularly as this fresco would be in full view of everyone, as they're all looking at the altar during Mass, and then you have these hundreds of figures, and many of them are naked. Michelangelo wanted to convey that at death we are all stripped of all worldly rank and wealth. So the only figure in the entire of all 400 figures, the only one that is entirely clothed is the Blessed Mother. She's clothed neck to ankle with a veil over her head. Even Christ is not fully clothed. He's covered like with a sort of a loincloth thing, but even he's not fully clothed. Now, not everybody, everybody had different, views on this. The master of ceremonies of the papal household was a guy named Biagio de Cesena. He was particularly offended, indicating that the paintings were more appropriate for a brothel or a tavern. Michelangelo avenged himself by painting King Minos in the underworld, the guy with the donkey ears, with the face of Biagio. When Biagio complained to the Pope, Pope Paul III replied, jokingly, that if Michelangelo had painted Biagio in purgatory, then he as the Pope could help, but that papal jurisdiction did not extend to hell. So Biagio's face is still on, the Minos with the donkey ears. Michelangelo died on February 8th, 1564. Later the same year, Daniello Ricciarelli de Volterra was commissioned to cover the, shall we say, the reproductive areas of the figures on that painting with loincloths or fig leaves. For this, he was mocked with the title of Il Bregettone, the breeches maker, or the underwear maker. The entire piece, The Last Judgment, was restored between 1980 and 1994, along with the Sistine ceiling. The restoration revealed a stunningly vivid use of color. Now, on the whole, The Last Judgment is a crushing work. It's clearly by a man who was in supreme command of his talent, but also an older man in the autumn of what had been a very hard life. Some of that hardship was self-inflicted, not all of it, but still, it was a hard life. It was painted for a church that had been humbled and had suffered much because of the protest movements since Michelangelo had painted the ceiling almost 3 decades earlier. And also, between it's in the same chapel as the Sistine ceiling, but also you can actually look, since it's on the back wall, you can actually look at it and see the whole thing. Whereas with the ceiling, you got to go look at it. And the ceiling, it's so long that visually you can't take it all in as easily as seeing The Last Judgment. Anyway, if COVID ever ends, hopefully if you haven't seen it, you'll get to go. It's on the tours. They have different. Well, before COVID, they had different tours you could take through the Vatican Museum, but I think all of them eventually passed through the Sistine. Paul III also recruited reform-minded prelates for the College of Cardinals, and he made some outstanding choices who were going to affect the next generation. One, Giovanni Carafa, was the founder of the Theatines and later became Pope Paul IV. Marcello Cervini later became Pope Marcellus II. Another was Gasparo Contarini, and another was Reginald Pole, Pole. On March 9th, 1537, they submitted a secret report to the Holy Father on the state of the church and needed reforms. Because of they wouldn't have called it the feudalism problem and the Renaissance problem, but, we've talked about it so much that you should know what I mean by now. This is the Concilium de Eminenda Ecclesia. The report contained a mercilessly frank assessment of church corruption. It listed recommended reforms, every single one of which would eventually be included in the Council of Trent. Candidly admitted that the hostility among the mass of people, which made the protest movement, the Protestant movement, possible, was largely to be blamed on the church itself. The report was leaked and used by Protestants in anti-Catholic polemics. But the truth is the truth. And this report did form the basis for papal reform policy into the next century. To this end, Pope Paul III summoned a church council to enact the needed reforms. Initially summoned to meet in Mantua in 1537. If you look on the list, there is no Council of Mantua in church history. And here we see the baneful consequences of the mistrust between Paul III and Charles V, who was still Holy Roman Emperor. Owing to Paul's sympathy for Charles's enemy, Francis I, the King of France, and owing to Paul's own fear that Charles was already too powerful and that he always had to be obstructed from achieving his ambitions to control both Lombardy in northern Italy and Naples, Sicily in the south. Charles, when of course he received the letter about the council, he refused to provide safe conduct for any bishop in his domains to attend a church council held in the Papal States or on Italian soil. Now remember, these are not free societies, these monarchies. So without a safe conduct, that's like a passport, essentially. So without that, if they left without the monarch's permission, then they would be considered outlaws. And so when they tried to go back, they would be subject to arrest and prosecution. Now remember, Charles's domains, what that includes, it's Austria, it's the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, and all Spain's dominions in the New World. So without their participation, then there's no point in having a council. But Charles was not against a council. He was just mad. He was still mad at the papacy. So he just wanted to kind of, do something to put him in there, put the Pope in his place, as he thought. So he counter-proposed that a council meet in Germany at a city such as Nuremberg or Cologne. Now, Paul refused to consider such a location because there were the civil wars that were going on in Germany. I mean, it was an idiotic proposal. He feared the radicalism and violence in Germany. He foresaw a possibility in which the bishops, all the bishops in the world, surrounded and possibly kidnapped or captured or murdered. I mean, that would have been ridiculous. So the idea of a council was obstructed for a time. Not for theological reasons, but because of this, stupidity, Okay, we'll talk about this next thing more in the fourth year course on the Church in the United States. But about the New World, I've mentioned a few things, conquest in the New World. There were voices of conscience which developed into protest of a different kind. Not protest like the Protestant movement in its theology, but protest in terms of human rights. Protest to the Spanish court about the treatment of the indigenous people in the New World, the mistreatment that they were receiving. Protests largely were ignored by the colonial council. Well, no, I forgot if I talked about this. Well, okay, if I'm repeating, I'm sorry, but if not, I mean, I'm going to go into this more in the American history course, but you should have it in context here and chronologically here. So, previous papal rulings on the matter of how to deal with the indigenous people came first in before Columbus stumbled on the Americas. The Portuguese conquered the Azores Islands. I mean, the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa, and they enslaved the population, the native population. And Portugal was a Catholic monarchy, so when the Pope heard about it, this was Pope Eugenius IV, he issued a papal direction commanding them to free them. That this was a wrong act. So that's January 13th, 1435. So prohibiting the enslavement of indigenous people by right of conquest, because that was the Portuguese. Okay, we won, so they're ours. In 1442, again, this is still before Columbus, a Portuguese mariner named Nuno Tristão landed in what is now Mauritania on the west coast of Africa. He captured 29 Muslims engaged in the caravan trade, tortured them in order to obtain information about the Sahara Desert, how large it was, and where Arab caravans found African gold. Because they knew they had access to it from the Mediterranean ports, but there were no gold mines in those ports, so they knew it had to come from somewhere. And so, this guy wanted to know so he could go directly to the gold mines and then not have to pay the handling fee to the Muslim caravans to get the gold. These 29 guys, their sheikh, their chief, felt responsible for his men. So he offered to Tristão to exchange an equal number of slaves, African slaves that he owned, for the same number of his men. And in a decision that changed history, Tristão took the deal. Now, these were black Africans who were not Muslim. They were animists, which is a different religion. So the Muslims could enslave them. And this, 1442, is the beginning of the European traffic in African slaves. 1462, again, still before Columbus, Pope Pius II stipulated that baptized Christians were not to be enslaved, which is why the missionaries baptized thousands at a time. The secular histories of, how stupid they were, what were the but they thought they were going to protect, the Indians by baptizing them. By the reign of Pope Paul III, there were 9 million baptisms in Mexico had taken place, in part as part of the strategy of protecting the indigenous people from enslavement. The first generation of Franciscan missionaries performed prodigies of language acquisition. The earliest play written in the indigenous Nahuatl language was composed by a Franciscan, Luis de Fuensalida, Fuensalida, published or performed in 1535 during the reign of Paul III. It was a play about the Annunciation, so using the arts to, for as teaching, as catechesis. These early Franciscan missionaries built church monastery complexes as the center of what they saw as new Christian communities for the converted Indians. Feeling no threats from the indigenous culture, they allowed indigenous artists to use their own techniques to create works of religious art, some of which have survived. The next step was allowing the Indians to compose music on their own, expressing theology they learned from the friars. To facilitate the expansion of the faith, the friars experimented with what we would call lay catechists. A pictorial catechism was created for them to use as the basis for initial instruction, with those who could not read or know Spanish. The problem, and the friars are very successful with this strategy, that first generation of friars. The problem with their success is that it deprived the encomenderos, that's basically plantations, the plantation owners, deprived them of the free labor that they needed to work their mines and plantations. Once an Indian was baptized and had taken up residence in one of the friars' doutrinas, their religious colonies, then they were off limits and they could not be enslaved. So the encomenderos, the predecessors to the hacendados, the dons, the plantation owners, retaliated by trying to twist the law to their advantage. They argued before the Spanish royal, well, not the court, the colonial council, that the baptism of Indians was invalid because the Indians have no soul. Why do they have no soul? Well, they're not human. Therefore, they argued, there was no reason to create parishes for them, or to catechize them, or to baptize them, which kept them from productive labor. This argument had an appeal to a certain segment of society and the government that profited off of the enslavement. So the evidence used that this was taken seriously, and so there's a judicial process created where they actually were arguing about this: are Indians humans, and therefore can they be baptized? So the evidence that they were not human and had no soul and should not be baptized, they pointed to the practice of human sacrifice, which was discovered. Now that is a horrifying practice, but so like the Aztecs who practiced human sacrifice, they were not sacrificing other Aztecs. The Aztecs were an invader, and so they imposed a military ascendancy over pre-existing populations, and the human sacrifice was a technique of terror. So they used others, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Zapotecs. The Aztecs sacrificed them. They didn't sacrifice other Aztecs. And in fact, that's how Spain conquered Mexico. So Cortez landed with 500 men. I mean, he couldn't conquer Mexico with 500 men, even though they had guns. But there were so many of the others who hated the Aztecs for mass murdering, their own people, that they sided to overthrow the Aztecs. So that's a specious argument. Second is that their alleged sexual immorality meant that they were not human, and that's rich. Now, by sexual immorality, those making the allegation were referring to polygamy, which was a practice in the indigenous cultures, but in the real world, in actual village life, it was only the chief and maybe some of the elders who had multiple wives. So even though it was socially permitted, in reality, monogamy was more customary, just because people didn't have resources to have multiple wives. Third argument is the absence of civilization, which was proven by the scanty clothing that they wore. They don't. They just anyway. Okay. Fourth allegation is that they were lazy. And what does that mean? Well, they didn't want to be slaves, to work in the mines and plantations. Therefore, they're lazy. Okay. Yeah. So, because this was being taken seriously, Pope Paul III, once he was made to believe that people actually were taking this seriously, he had to say something, which he did. June 2nd, 1537, Sublimus Deus. Quote, "The sublime God so loved the human race that he created man in such way that he might participate not only in the good that other creatures enjoy, but endow him with capacity to attain to the inaccessible and invisible supreme good. The enemy of the human race, who opposes all good deeds in order to bring men to destruction, beholding and envying this, invented a means never before heard of, by which he might hinder the preaching of God's word of salvation to the people. He inspired his satellites abroad, that the Indians of the West and the South, and other people of whom we had recent knowledge, should be treated as dumb brutes created for our service, pretending that they are incapable of receiving the Catholic faith. And then skipping down, it's too long to read the whole thing, but so at the end, by virtue of our apostolic authority, we define and declare by this present letter that the said Indians and other peoples should be converted to the faith of Jesus Christ by preaching the word of God and by the example of good and holy living. That seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Well, there's another aspect of papal history. Whenever popes issue a teaching, there are going to be some who say, well, this is what the Pope really meant. This is what the Pope really said. Now what I just read is what the Pope really said. It seems pretty clear to me, but no, okay. So this brings us to Francisco de Vitoria, Vitoria, lived from 1483 to 1546. In the context of debates over what exactly the Pope meant and what changes in Spanish colonial policy it required, in which Vitoria participated, led to the development of a theology of international law. He was a Dominican, a theologian on the faculty of the University of Salamanca in Spain. In 1538, the year after Paul III Sublimus Deus, Vitoria published the De Indies Prior, meaning first lecture, on the Indies. The following year, 1539, he published De Indies Posterior, later lecture on the Indies. He argued that, in the same way, there was a natural law governing the human body, meaning, we all need food, water. So also there was a natural law governing the behavior of nations as social bodies. This natural law of nations, he argued, dictated that the Indians had a natural right to their own property and to their own rulers. So he rejected as specious all the justifications for war against that have been put forward, the idolatry, the polygamy, the savage condition. Even more radically, he denied that either the Pope or the Emperor had a right to judge the Indians at all for anything, for any crimes that were alleged to have been committed, or to grant sovereignty over their lands to Christian rulers. The refusal of the Indians to accept the overlordship of either the Pope or the Emperor was their right. It was not a justification for making war against them. He argued that the natural right of self-defense justified their resistance to the Spanish conquistadors. And he's a Spaniard himself, so he's criticizing his own, practices by some of his own fellow countrymen. He included vivid eyewitness accounts of how the encomenderos enslaved the Indians, chopping off ears, noses, inflicting other forms of torture if they did not work hard enough in order to intimidate others. However, Vitoria did believe that this natural law of nations contained within itself conditions that could justify war, a just war theology. It had to be waged by just authority, waged for a just cause, using means that were not intrinsically immoral. There had to be a reasonable expectation of success, meaning that a reasonable expectation that the just cause could be achieved by means of war, and that the proportion of good achieved by the just cause would outweigh any unintended but foreseeable evil consequences from the act of war. With this paradigm, Vitoria argued the reverse, that war against the Indians could be justified but for different reasons. The spread of the gospel was a just cause. The Pope and Emperor were the just authorities to undertake such a cause. If pagan kings, meaning the rulers of the Indians, fought against that conversion effort or forcibly prevented their subjects from converting, then war against them, in Vittoria's line of thinking, would be justified. He also believed that charity required that war be waged if it was the only means through which intrinsically evil practices that harm the innocent could be halted, meaning halting the practice of human sacrifice and cannibalism. Okay, Pope Paul, again, called for a church council, not for this issue, but back to dealing with the Protestant movement, this time to meet at Vicenza in 1538. Since Charles refused to support a council in papal territory, Vicenza, to Paul's mind, was a reasonable compromise. It was in northern Italy. It was in the territory of Venice. Venice had often been enemies of the Holy See, and no one could believe that the Venetians would be puppets of the Holy See. Still, Charles refused to agree to a council on Italian soil. He was being petty. I mean, really, that's because, he's just being petty. So he suggested Bavaria as an alternative. That was in southern Germany. It was solidly Catholic, and it was closer to Italy. Negotiations for this continued and on until it became academic. The Habsburg-Valois conflict, which was temporarily halted but never completely ended, erupted again, meaning that no council could meet anywhere. And it would be another 8 long years during which so much could have been accomplished before the council actually did open. And it wouldn't be at Vicenza. Nevertheless, despite his pettiness, for which I do blame him, Charles realized what was happening, and that was the background for his forming the Catholic League of Nuremberg. Which brings us to 1542. This Protestant Schmalkaldic League, for the first time in 1542, used military force to expel a Catholic ruler from a German state who refused to join them and become Protestant. Prior to that, since its founding 11 years earlier in 1531, previous members joined freely, seeking their own political and financial advantage by using Protestantism as a mantle of legitimacy for looting the Catholic Church in their territory. By 1542, the League felt strong enough to take the next step. They approached the Duke Heinrich, he's German, Duke Heinrich of Brunswick, and invited him to join the League, and he refused. He was to stay Catholic. So the League then felt strong enough to ambush him, capture him, and exile him, and then ambush, capture, and exile the bishop of the Brunswick, the Bishop Julius von Pflug. So here we have another civil war, in Germany. So we're up to, I think this is the fifth civil war in Germany, just strictly over this during the protest movement. A war between the Schmalkaldic League of Protestants and the Catholic League of Nuremberg. Initially, the Protestants appeared destined to win because the bulk of Charles's forces were occupied fighting the French. There's something else happened in Peru, but yeah, okay, I'll talk about it. In the same, in the same year, 1542, Charles V, but in his capacity as King Carlos I of Spain, that's the same person, issued what are called the New Laws of 1542, in changing Spanish colonial policy. The new laws forbade the enslavement or the forced labor of the Indians. It ended the practice of hereditary encomienda and placed the Indians under the protection of the crown. The encomienda was a land grant to attract colonists, in which they were given, in exchange for land, they would be given absolute control over the land and any Indians in the land, in exchange for providing military service and, of course, paying taxes to the crown. So he ended that. He didn't end the practice, but he ended the hereditary, making it hereditary. This change in the law triggered an immediate revolt among Spanish encomenderos in Peru. We previously mentioned the mass murderer Francisco Pizarro. What happened in that region of South America because of Pizarro is one of the atrocities of history. The tribes, which had been part of the Inca Empire, felt an affinity and loyalty for the Inca that was completely absent from the attitude in Mexico toward the Aztecs previously. In 1535, Charles V, Carlos I of Spain, fearful of allowing a person like Pizarro to become too powerful, divided the governorship of Peru between Pizarro and another murderer, Diego de Almagro. Almagro spread what had become the worst example of European behavior to date in Chile and Bolivia. Perceiving that the two men despised each other, those they subjugated perceived opportunity. That same year, 1535, a relative of the murdered Inca Atahualpa, his relative's name was Manco, M-A-N-C-O, led a revolt against the Spaniards. Manco and his general, his name was Quizo Yupanqui, annihilated 2 columns of Spanish reinforcements. But in the end, Spanish military power overcame them, meaning, gunpowder technology. 2 years and many thousands of corpses later, this Inca revolt was suppressed. Then the conquistadors began to feed on each other. In April of 1538, Pizarro and Almagro engaged in battle against each other outside of Cusco. Pizarro was the superior general, so he defeated and captured Almagro. He refused Almagro the honor of an execution as a soldier, instead amusing himself by torturing his defeated enemy. He managed to keep Almagro alive for 3 months before he died. Almagro's son avenged his father's death in 1541 by assassinating Pizarro. Pizarro's brother Gonzalo then took over and prepared to avenge his brother. It was into this atmosphere that the new laws of 1542 on the treatment of Indians in Spanish colonies was delivered. Gonzalo Pizarro knew that without the slave labor and the unregulated brutality of the encomienda system, and without unrestricted access to native women, that he would lose the loyalty of the goons that followed him. So Gonzalo, proving that he was not to be outdone in criminal activity by his late brother, led a revolt against the King of Spain in the same year, 1542. By 1546, he was so successful that he managed to kill the Spanish viceroy, the highest-ranking colonial official in Peru. This was Blasco Vila, V-E-L-A. It took 6 years to defeat Gonzalo Pizarro, but by April of 1548, it finally happened. Gonzalo's forces were decisively defeated outside of Cusco. Pizarro himself was captured and executed. The nightmare of the Pizarro family had finally been removed from Peru. The new president of the Royal Audiencia in Peru, the Royal Council in Peru, was a priest, Father Pedro de la Gasca. He brought in Franciscan friars to heal the damage by instituting the system that had worked so well for them in Mexico. In 1544, silver was discovered in Potosi, Peru, which would be a source of much suffering and hardship for the indigenous peoples. In 1544, the latest of the Habsburg-Valois Wars ended on September 18th with a peace. Charles was able then to transfer his main army back to Germany to deal with the civil war of the Schmalkaldic League versus the Catholic League of Nuremberg. Okay. With the successful conclusion of that war, Pope Paul III revived the idea of a church council, but the problem of location remained. Charles V would not back down. He would not accept an Italian site, and the Pope would not risk a German location. The solution was presented by an English aristocrat who was a cardinal, Cardinal Reginald Pole. He proposed he proposed that the council meet at the city of Trent. It was on the Italian side of the Alps, but it was technically German soil because it was under the control of the Habsburg family. So all sides agrees to this compromise, and the Council of Trent opened on December 13th, 1545. Over the next 18 years, yes, 18 years, the Council of Trent would meet for 25 sessions, divided into 3 distinct periods. It was the official beginning of the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, or the Catholic Renewal. The Council of Trent would treat both reform and doctrine concurrently. It is referenced 103 times in the current catechism. Session 1, December 13th, 1545, was just the opening of the council. Pope Paul III was not present, as he did not trust, he didn't want to go into a city, that had German troops in it. He didn't trust Charles. But he appointed those who would run it. It was controlled by 3 cardinal legates: Jean Maria del Monte, who was the future Pope Julius III, Reginald Pole, the English cardinal whom we just met, and Marcello Cervini, who was the future Pope Marcellus II. The next year, 1546, Pope Paul III named Michelangelo the 3rd architect of St. Peter's Basilica. Remember, the old basilica was torn down, and the new one had been under construction since April 18th, 1506, and it would not be completed and dedicated until 1626. Michelangelo's contribution to St. Peter's was the dome, which stands now at a height of 448 feet from the floor of the basilica. It has an interior diameter of 136 feet. Michelangelo had planned to retain the original Greek cross footprint designed by the first architect, Donato Bramante. In 1602, long after Michelangelo was dead, the dome was completed. The 6th architect, Carlo Maderno, changed the design, the footprint of the church, to be a Latin cross footprint. This required the nave, the center aisle, to be elongated, which is why it is not possible to see the full dome when standing in front of the basilica, because it was proportioned for a Greek cross floor plan, where all 4 axes of the cross would be of equal length. Michelangelo also added external coherence to the church by the device of Corinthian columns alternated with pilasters. So that, looking around, so you have a pilaster would go from the floor all the way up to the roof, and so you had these 2 parallel. But then within them, they'd be divided, and so you'd have the smaller Corinthian columns But that was carried around the whole exterior of the church to give it visual coherence. Anyway, that was so the same year, Session 2, January 7th, 1546, of the council was a general outline of the procedures that the council would use. Session 3, February 4th, 1546, was a routine reaffirmation of the Nicene Creed as amended at the First Council of Constantinople in 381 and the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Session 4, April 8, 1546, listed the canon of Scripture to be accepted as normative for theological arguments and canonical decisions by the Council. It listed the 46-book Old Testament of St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate and the 27-book New Testament. So the canon of Scripture is discussed in the Catechism, our Catechism, numbers 120 through 130. Magisterial recognition of this canon, the 46 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, can be traced to Pope Damasus I, D-A-M-A-S-A-S, who was Pope from 366 to 384. He's the one who commissioned St. Jerome to produce a coherent Latin text of the Bible, because Pope Damasus wanted to transition Roman liturgy from Greek into Latin. Pope Damasus held a synod in Rome in 382, which listed that canon, 46 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, and so that's what Jerome followed. It should be noted that this canon had been reiterated by the Council of Florence in 1439 in the context of the Decree of Union with the Coptic Christians of Egypt. They were Monophysites. The canon was listed again at the opening of Trent with Protestant methodology in mind because, as the Council explained, quote, "The Council further decrees, in order to control those of unbalanced character, that no one, relying on his personal judgment in matters of faith and customs, which are linked to the establishment of Christian doctrine, shall dare to interpret the sacred Scriptures either by twisting its text to his individual meaning, in opposition to that which has been and is held by Holy Mother Church, whose function is to pass judgment on the true meaning and interpretation of the sacred Scriptures, or by giving it meaning contrary to the unanimous consent of the Fathers, even if interpretations of this kind were never intended for publication." End quote. Now, that's all one sentence. All right. It is noteworthy that even this early, the Council decided that in terms of hermeneutics, I mean an interpretive paradigm, that no compromise would be made with the protest movement. So by, the whole personal judgment thing, that's all the Protestant hermeneutic. It's a subjective hermeneutic, meaning, the individual conscience is the one that is the arbiter. So they're saying right at the beginning, that's not what the Council's going to do. That, the church it's a hierarchical structure. And, the church believes it is hierarchical because that's the way Jesus intended, that the first 12 apostles had the fullness of the priesthood, and their successors of the bishops share that priesthood with ordination with other priests, but they still have the fullness of the high priesthood of Christ. And so there is a hierarchy. And in terms of teaching on matters of faith and morals, that protection that Jesus extended in Matthew 16, which you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, that endures. The canon, it's also noteworthy that the canon list includes 7 books of the Old Testament which Protestants rejected. The book of Judith, Tobit, Sirach, which some of your Bibles may title it Ecclesiasticus, Wisdom, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and Baruch. It also specified which edition of the Bible could be officially used. Quote, "It, the council," meaning the Council of Trent, "decides and declares that the old, well-known Latin Vulgate edition, which has been tested in the Church by long use over so many centuries, should be kept as the authentic text in public reading, debates, sermons, and explanations. And no one is to dare or presume on any pretext to reject it." Okay, Trent, Session 5, June 17th, 1546. Having established that Scripture and tradition would be the basis for the Council's decisions, and having established what it meant by Scripture and tradition, the Council then needed to treat the doctrinal issues raised by the protest movement, the most famous being Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone. But before that could be debated, the issue of original sin had to be defined, because so many of Luther's doctrines were built on his anthropology, which, remember, is the depravity of the human person. So from the Catholic perspective, his defective understanding of human nature is what led to his defective soteriology. So by misunderstanding the nature of the human person, he misunderstood the nature of what it would be required for the human person to be saved. So it all goes back to original sin. So justification, well, what is original sin? What is the harm that it did to us? And how are we healed from that, or how are we protected from that? So it all goes. So original sin had to be clarified first before the issue of justification in response to that original sin could be articulated. So the issue of original sin was debated from May 21st through June 17th, 1546. Luther's assertion, and from the Catholic perspective his error, was in believing that original sin was an invincible attraction for evil, which we feel. He saw that attraction, he saw concupiscence itself as a sin, not merely as a consequence of original sin. There is a difference. Because of that assumption, Luther had to create another one, justification by faith alone, to cope with it. The Council Fathers agreed that the error on original sin had to be clarified first. But as early as the first day of the debate, it was obvious that the Council Fathers each came from different theological schools of thought. Those following St. Anselm of Bec, who was also Anselm of Aosta, also Anselm of Canterbury, lived from 1033 to 1109, argue that original sin was nothing more than the loss of original justice that we had at creation. Now that could lead, Anselm didn't directly assert this, but that could lead to the conclusion that concupiscence was merely learned, that it was merely a bad habit. Those following St. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430, saw original sin as a disorder in nature, corrupting our judgment with concupiscence, filling us with a perennial fascination for sin. Those following Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican, lived from 1225 through 1274, believed that original sin was best understood in the classical categories of form and matter. The form of original sin being a disorder in the human will, pulling it away from the will of God. The matter being the disordered human senses, which are drawn to disordered behavior. An additional aspect of the debate was the determination of a Spanish cardinal, Cardinal Bishop of Jaen, Jaen, whose name was Pedro Pacheco, Pacheo. He repeatedly and vociferously argued that the doctrine of original sin could not be defined until the council defined the Immaculate Conception of Mary, since she was preserved from original sin. Now, German prelates at the council did not want to mention the Immaculate Conception because they still hoped for reconciliation with the Protestants. And they knew that Mary, that was an issue, is that many of the Protestants accuse us of worshiping Mary as a goddess, which of course is not true, but that's what they said. So the German prelates were, so okay, if we, then there's no point in trying to fix it, because then that they're immediately going to ignore us. Now, Cardinal Pacheco didn't care about reconciliation with Protestants because he considered that was already done. Everybody's choice was already made, but he did care about Mary, as we've seen. The history of the Church in Spain had a long heritage of devotion to Our Lady. At the General Congregation of May 28, 1546, it was decided that the council would not attempt to resolve disputes between different Catholic theological schools of thought, but only define doctrines challenged by the protest movement. Everyone agreed except Cardinal Pacheco, who inserted into every single address the demand that the Immaculate Conception of Mary be defined by the council. And he repeatedly said, the commandments summon us to honor our father and mother. So should we not honor the mother of the Lord? The final version of the doctrinal decree on original sin contains 6 distinctions. Distinction 1. Adam's sin lost the state of original holiness and justice. It incurred divine wrath, bodily death, and vulnerability to temptation by the devil, and it changed our body and soul for the worst. Distinction 2. Adam's sin injured his posterity, meaning his descendants, us, not only him alone. His sin is transmitted to the whole human race as sin, death, and pain in the body. And the council there parenthetically cites Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 12. Distinction 3. Adam's sin is transferred to all by propagation, not imitation alone. Meaning sin is not just a bad habit we learn. And the merits of Christ can apply to infants as well as adults. Distinction 4. Infants are to be baptized, arguing that the sin contracted by generation is washed away by regeneration. So this is addressed in the Anabaptist who rejected that. And parenthetically refers to Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 5. Distinction 5. Through the sacrament of baptism, the grace of Jesus Christ remits the guilt of original sin, meaning that the baptized person is made innocent, with nothing hindering entrance into heaven. Parenthetic reference, letter to the Romans, chapter 6, verse 4. Concupiscence, the inclination to sin, does remain after baptism, but it is not in itself sinful unless and until it is acted upon. And 6th, Cardinal Pacheco did not get an entire decree on the Immaculate Conception, but he refused to allow the council to move on without giving honor to Our Lady. So the decree on original sin ends by saying, quote, the council declares that it is not its intention to include in this decree, dealing with original sin, the Blessed and Immaculate Virgin Mary, Mother of God, but rather that observance must be given to the constitutions of Pope Sixtus IV of happy memory. So the reference was to a special Mass and office in the Breviary in honor of the Immaculate Conception, approved by Pope Sixtus IV in 1476. So Pacheco at least got some of his way. as the inclusion of this in the council's decrees necessarily meant that the doctrine itself was approved. And of course, this is still, church teaching. You can refresh your memories in the Catechism, numbers 490 through 493. Session 5, Reformed Decree, June 17th, 1546. So coupled with the doctrinal statement on original sin, the council approved a reform decree which demanded that those in preparation for holy orders be trained to preach, and that this training include formal study of sacred scripture. It even stipulated that the bishop must set aside a benefice to support the teachers of these subjects. This was the beginning of what would become the post-Tridentine seminary system. So seminarians, this is where it started, June 17th, 1546. Session 6, January 13th, 1547. After having defined the correct doctrine of original sin, the council immediately moved to consideration of a central proposition of Lutheranism, is soteriology, justification by faith alone. The debates lasted for 7 months, from June 1546 to January 1547. Luther argued that we are justified through faith because the faults of the person are cloaked over by the merits of Christ. That's his phrase, cloaked over. Because we are worthless in the eyes of God, Luther taught that our good works are no more than dirty rags. It's his words, dirty rags that must be cloaked over by the merits of Christ. The council knew they had to get this one right, which is one reason the debates took so long. Another reason was that 2 entire months were consumed debating a single point. It was a well-intentioned but misguided attempt by the superior general of the Augustinian friars to formulate a compromise that might draw moderate Lutherans back into communion with the church. Now, Luther, of course, had been Augustinian, so this guy felt, he felt that he wanted to fix it. His name was Girolamo, Girolamo, Seripando, Seripando. Seripando posited a theory of double justification as a compromise. The first justification would be the act of faith, which brought with it inherent justice, or sanctifying grace. Through that, good might be done in the world. The second justification would be the imputed grace of Christ, needed to make up for the defects in our actions, because no good we do is ever enough. The debate became intense, tempers frayed. Seripando's double justification was ridiculed in a scathing denunciation by Antoine Filhuil, the abbot of Ai, and by Diego Lainez, the Jesuit. They argued that Seripando was fabricating an unsupportable theological construction in order to become reconciled to Luther's unsupportable theological construction. It was like building a sandcastle to prop up another sandcastle. In the end, it was rejected. The final decree, January 13th, 1547, on justification, consisted of 33 canons. Now, I won't go through all of them. I'll just summarize a few. Canon 1, self-justification is not possible, meaning we cannot save ourselves. We do need God. Canon 9, faith alone cannot justify. Canon 17, justification is not limited to a predestined group. So that's addressing Calvinists. Canon 32, good works of the justified are good merits for the justified, meaning they count. And Canon 33, kind of a safety, all-encompassing. The Council's doctrine on justification does not derogate from the glory of God or the merits of Christ. Session 7, March 3rd, 1547. The decree on baptism, 14 canons. The decree on confirmation, 3 canons. And you can refresh your memories in the Catechism. On baptism, numbers 1213 through 1274. And on confirmation, from 1285 to 1314. At this point, the progress of the council came to an unexpected halt. The Schmalkaldic War, the civil war in Germany between the Schmalkaldic League and the Nuremberg League, between Protestants and Catholics, was in its final year. Charles was making good progress once he was able to concentrate his army in the region. In January of 1547, Pope Paul III and Charles V had another of their temperamental disagreements. Paul III was furious that Charles was accepting the surrender of Protestant cities without imposing the condition that they return to the Catholic faith, that they return stolen church property, and that those guilty of assault, murder of church personnel be prosecuted. Charles replied that his position was far from strong enough to impose such conditions. The Pope retaliated by withdrawing his financial subsidy and the mercenaries that he was paying for to fight in Charles's army. Charles then flew into a rage, and he shouted before dozens of witnesses, including the papal ambassador, that he was conscious of having done his duty as a Christian prince better than any pope in 100 years. When Paul heard this, they weren't in the same room, of course, so these are, messengers going back and forth. When Paul heard this, he became concerned at what Charles might do to the council. So he used the excuse of unhealthy conditions in Trent. It was an outbreak of typhus, to move the council to Bologna without consulting Charles first. Now, he should have known better because of all that it took years, literally years, for them to even decide on a location. The bishops at Trent, who were from territories under the emperor's control, did not dare to leave imperial soil without his permission. A safe conduct, which is, their analog of a passport today. Charles was so angry that he threatened to take over the council himself, which was exactly what the Pope feared. But in the end, the Habsburgs, with only one exception in the 18th century, would never did take open action against the church. They'd have temperamental things like this, but apart from that one exception, they never acted openly against the church as a whole. During this period, it was learned that the three men who had caused much harm to the church died in this period. Henry VIII, who murdered 72,000 of his own people, who resisted his break from Rome. That's if you count all those who died in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry died in the tertiary stages of syphilis on January 28, 1547. Martin Luther, who started it all, died on February 18, 1546. Francis I, the King of France, who often betrayed the church but never left it, died of complications from venereal disease on March 31, 1547. The following month, April 11th, 1547, Session 8 of the Council, was a decree put into the record transferring the Council from Trent to Bologna. Bologna is in the Papal State. Despite the progress made, neither Charles nor the Germans nor the French delegation would consent to moving to a city under the Pope's direct control. Charles forbade his bishops from attending. So when this session opened, only 17 prelates were present, of the 80 who had been present at the previous session. 14 of the Council Fathers remained in Trent. The rest simply went home. April 21st, 1547, Session 9. prorogued the council due to a lack of quorum. Prorogue is it's a parliamentary so it's not closing the council, not ending it, but a delay, and not postpone, because that suggests that it's being interrupted. So in this case, it's okay. We're proroguing. We're still in session, but we don't have a quorum, meaning not enough people to have a legitimate vote. The Battle of Muhlenberg took place on 3 days later, on April 24th, 1547. Charles won a decisive victory over the Protestant Schmalkaldic League, inflicting 2,000 casualties while suffering only 50 in his own forces. Still, his position, at least he believed, was not strong enough to reimpose Catholicism throughout Germany. Many have criticized him for this, for not having tried, as this was the last time when it would have even been conceivable, while others have criticized him for having waged war at all against those who became Protestant. So, it's not easy to judge Charles or what he should have done. The Protestant movement was one of those events, that was beyond any single individual to control. It was like the avalanche, sometimes there just is no happy ending. June 2nd, 1547, Session 10. Prorogued the council again due to a lack of quorum. And on September 14th, 1547, Paul III bowed to the inevitable and prorogued the council indefinitely. It would not be resumed in his lifetime. He died 2 years later in 1549. Tired of fighting and in poor health, Charles agreed to an imperial declaration which substituted for an armistice with the Protestant states in Germany. Most history books call this armistice the Augsburg Interim. Augsburg is a place in Germany, Augsburg, Augsburg Interim, dated March 12, 1549, which is not the same as the Augsburg Confession or the Peace of Augsburg. All three of those things exist, but at different dates. This was the Augsburg Interim, by the terms of which it was agreed that the religion of a ruler in Germany would be the religion of his people, and that no attempts to change the prevailing status quo would be made. The Augsburg Interim legitimized the actions of Protestants who stole church property, vandalized Catholic cemeteries, vandalized sacred art, and assaulted, and in some cases killed, church personnel. I say legitimized, it didn't say it was great that they did it, but legitimized in the sense that the interim did not require the return of any stolen property, nor compensation for the damages caused, nor prosecution for those guilty of assault and murder. It was called the interim because it contained language that recognized a church council was still in effect, and the Protestant states agreed to send delegates to the council. Until a decision was reached, all sides agreed that at least 2 daily masses would be celebrated in each church in a Catholic manner, but that priests would be allowed to marry and distribute communion under both kinds, until the council ruled on those issues. The Pope flew into a rage when he heard about this, that the emperor would agree to such canonical procedures which were completely out of his jurisdiction. The Pope became moderated when he heard that the Bishop of Strasbourg tried to say Mass in his cathedral in accordance with the interim. It had been 4 years since the Protestants had eliminated the Mass in Strasbourg. The bishop was stoned by a mob and nearly lynched, and he never could say the Mass. He never could even get into the church. He escaped alive, but, said, so maybe, Paul thought, well, he wouldn't admit it to Charles, of course, but maybe Paul, thought, okay, maybe Charles has a point. Maybe it really is too late. It had been 3 decades since Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses, and Luther himself died 3 years earlier. The divisions were simply too deep. There would be no healing of divisions on a national level to this day. Paul III died on November 10th, 1549. He would be followed as Pope 221 by Julius III. So we will end here and pick up with that next time. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.